Hello, everyone. Good morning, good day, good evening, wherever you are situated in the world, and a warm welcome to today's online webinar. My name is Anna Bjärkerud, and I run EBG Network. EBG Network since 2010, bringing cross-function teams together to focus on sourcing, procurement, and finance as an end-to-end perspective, which we have, of course, seen a huge increase in interest the past years, for obvious reasons. We do webinars like today. We do usually 2 summits in the spring in Stockholm. In the autumn, we will do 1 2-day summit called CPO Outlook, where we will have roundtable discussions, workshops, and really make the most out of all people joining, GEP joining as well. We have a website and we do write articles, and in as many ways as is possible, try to bring different perspectives together to help you who listen in to become the wiser, to draw from each other's experiences, not the least from a change management and cross-function perspective and cross-organization, like today when we're talking about the importance of bringing suppliers closer to us in the network of supplies. And I think that the topic of today, which is cascading trust down all tiers, I think all tiers, we could do a full stop there and consider, what do companies even know? What do you even know about your nth tier supply chain and suppliers? A challenge for sure. We are talking about risk and resilience. We are talking about scope 3 being more and more a wider scope of ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And why is that? And then we're talking about optimization. And I think Vaughn and Graham, who are with us here today and will be the ones doing the talking, if you can share some light on how companies can and should think of that risk resilience, scope 3 ESG in relation to building supplier relationships, that would be, I mean, hands up. This is something that everyone is struggling with, and not the least because of the challenges actually getting those insights, getting access to that data to help make better decisions, to help have that more in-depth conversations with a network, internally and externally. We will involve you who listen in as much as you can, no musts or have tos, but it would be great to tap into the great companies that are with us here today. A huge thank you to GEP for enabling this session for us. We'll learn a bit more about who GEP are. And I think with that, I should hand over to you, Vaughn, and you, Graham. Audio and video are yours. A warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Anna. And let me start with some further thanks to EBG. Thank you to Norway for the Wolf and Banana song. Thank you for Henrik Larsson as a Glaswegian for Sweden. And thank you for voting for the UK last Saturday at the Eurovision Song Contest. So I'm very pleased to be here today. What are we going to do in this 30-40 minutes? We're going to talk about trust. I believe that there is a trust problem between buyers and sellers, and where you're in a world where you're trying to do more and more with your supply base, this is something that needs to be addressed. What are you trying to do more of? You're trying to get closer to your suppliers to support your ESG agenda and improve information flows related to that. You're trying to build more risk and resilience into your supply chain. You're trying to deal with inflation. There's a lot of things you're trying to do, and you need to have suppliers that and partners that want to work with you. So we're going to finish the session by giving you some tips on how to build that trust. So let's dive straight into that. I'm joined today by Vaughn, who you can hopefully see on the screen as well, who is a sustainability consultant, one of our thought leaders in this space. So I'm delighted to have you here too, Vaughn.
Thanks, Graham. Happy to be here.
So where did trust go? There is a breakdown of trust in society. The Edelman Trust Barometer report, I just put this on the slide as an opening statement. Employees do not generally trust their CEOs, their own CEOs, in about 30% of the cases. They don't trust CEO leaders in general, and capitalism is often now seen as a source of harm rather than good based on that survey. So there's a breakdown of trust more generally. This does translate into buyer and seller relationships as well. When businesses, buyers, people like yourself have been asked, what do you think of sellers? Here's a word cloud of what you told them. You told them they were pushy, persistent, persuasive, but biased, aggressive, untrustworthy, self-interested, and so on. There are some positives in there too, but as you can see, the dominant word is pushy, trying to push their own vested interests. So not a great deal of trust emanating from buyers towards the selling community or your suppliers necessarily. So I thought we could open, if you're willing to engage in, I'm going to pass to Anna to run this, but just give us a few thoughts on if you were to construct a word cloud in the same vein. How are buyers perceived by sellers, do you think, and their stakeholders in one or two words? So how do you think sellers perceive you? Over to you, Anna.
Great. So straight away, we want to involve you who listen in. So we won't share, obviously, who says what. So it's a carte blanche. It's type in the questions section. How are buyers perceived by sellers and their stakeholders in one or two words, if you will, to wake you up this morning? If you're in Sweden, you may have been working a couple of hours or so, of course, but do type in the questions section, how are buyers perceived by sellers and their stakeholders in one or two words, if you will. Those of you who have signed on, we're going to involve you straight away and try to get some responses from you. A tricky one, Graham, as we thought it might be. People need to be woken up first. So under the questions section, should we continue? And you can type in one or two words that in your mind tell how buyers are perceived by sellers and their stakeholders. And I'll leave to you, Graham, to continue, because obviously you, like you say, this word cloud, you have an idea of what is going on and the perception and why that is of importance. So demanding, we have here. Demanding, that is price focus, obviously. So demanding and price focus are two great people who have typed in. Hard to reach, that is another one that one could imagine. Mm-hmm. Suspicious and solution oriented, another one. Great, thank you for those of you who have typed in. Continue to type that in and we might be able to come back to that. But suspicious and solution-oriented, hard to reach, price-focused, demanding are just a few ones that immediately came in top of mind. Graham, what do you make of this?
Yeah, that's great feedback. And you know, demanding is one of those dials that you can push too hard and too fast, or it can be just about right. It's not necessarily a positive or a negative, but we'll talk about demanding later on when we talk about reasonable asks in a world where you're trying to build relationships. Often suppliers receive asks of them that you wouldn't ask your team. We have greater hurdles that we put on sellers, on suppliers, than we would necessarily expect as reasonable on our own staff. And these are the kind of imbalances that we see when we ask similar questions in other forums. Typically, other ones that come up are policeman, enforcer, bad cop. These kind of phrases come on as well. Tough, sometimes fair as well. So it's often neutral or slightly negative phraseology used as well. So there's work to be done is the point here. Neither buyers or sellers are trusting each other. And some of that's, as we'll explore, is based on commercial dynamics, but there are many things you can do to improve that state in a VUCA world where you're trying to get closer and closer to your key stakeholder suppliers.
If I may add, Graham, I think I've seen both sides before. So on one end, it's where the sellers typically go directly to your engineers or your product teams to share anything that they have. And then the other end is where the suppliers are working very closely with the procurement organizations. Wherever they have new products or innovation, they go to the procurement team. And I think the difference between these two organizations is, first of all, it's the role that procurement has within the organization, but it's also the internal and external collaboration that they have. So if your product team and procurement team are aligned, then the suppliers know who to go to. And I think that's very important as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Fawn. Right. So we've established that there's a bit of a perception problem. I just put up briefly the Kraljic matrix. It's an example of a tool that's sacred to the purchasing profession. It's what puts strategic into sourcing. It's made of scientists, not artists. It's been one of the cornerstones of our profession. And when you look at it's 40 years old next year, perhaps it's driven some poor behaviours that now need to be addressed. And perhaps there's a time for this model to be refreshed. And indeed, a lot of the tools that procurement professionals have focused on, maybe there's a new toolkit needing to be built. Just to show you just drawing a couple of ideas from this. The aggression of focusing on price, that was one of the bits of feedback we had on the survey, can lead to that desire, which Vaughan mentioned, of bypassing procurement. The limited attention giving to historically non-critical parts leads to more bypassing, or because they just can't get hold of the procurement function because of limited resources. The concept of strategic partnerships, Kraljic himself acknowledges that this quadrant needed more thinking, but what buyers and sellers have done over the last 20 years is have moved from a concept of win-win, but to one where often sellers feel that they receive all the pain and little of the gain. So it leads to more adversarial relationships. So the question I pose is, does procurement's role as bad cop? It's often brought in by stakeholders to do the tough talk. Does that need changed if we're going to go into a world where procurement wants to take a greater leadership role in life relationship management to address some of these big macroeconomic problems? So let's just do another poll, if you would allow me. Here's 3 of the big agenda topics of the day. They're all critical. I'm sure you're all faced with all of them, but just in this moment, you have limited resources. And I wanted to just get a sense for, if you were only able to pick one, which would be the one that you would prioritize of these 3. It's an impossible choice, but I'm asking you to make it. So over to you, Anna.
Great. So now I've launched a poll question, which is, then again, given the limited resources, what is your main priority today? And of course, how do you choose? But just for the sake of getting a feel, an ESG, and I'm not sure, is ESG household today for everyone? I'm curious about that as well. Environmental, social, and corporate governance. And Vaughan, why do we not say scope 3 and say ESG instead? And please select one that you feel is the main priority for you today.
Yeah, and to answer your question, Anna, ESG is beyond just scope 3. ESG also, as you mentioned, it's environmental and social and governance as well. And I'll go a little bit into I'll deep dive a little bit more into scope 3 emissions, but ESG is a broader term.
Yeah. So if you will, what if you had to choose, and now you sort of have to, we'll show the results as a percentage. So I think it may be of some interest to see how your peers having logged on view what if you only have one option, which you actually only have here. What is your main priority out of these 3? Of course, I mean, if we would have had costs, that would probably, but then again, we have inflation. So ESG, risk and resilience, or inflation. Let's see, we can get 70% of you voting, if you will. What if you have to choose, would you say is your main priority today out of these 3? So we are getting closer to 60%. Let's see if we can get a few more of you voting for the sake of the results, and they'll only be shown as percentage. So I think, and obviously ESG being sort of the wider scope of scope 3 and beyond, from a corporate level, I suppose. So I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. And sharing the results. So 42% of you said ESG. 38% of you said risk and resilience, and 21% of you said inflation. And of course, these are quite, blunt options, if you will, but for the sake of the argument, I think it's still interesting to see. And Graham, what do you make of these results?
Well, it took me right back to Saturday night when the public vote from Ukraine overtook the UK massively, which was a great ending to the evening. Well, obviously, what we see is quite an even spread. Obviously, with a slight weighting in this group from ESG, that really helps me. We're trying to make this webinar practical action based. So we're going to briefly. These topics are massive, but we're going to spend 5 minutes offering you some practical tips on each of these 3 topics. But we'll give it a bit more weighting towards ESG now. And I'm delighted that that's the next topic on our agenda, and I'm going to pass to Yvonne.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Graham. Thanks, Anna. So what we have here is the 6 steps that we think how ESG and procurement can align. And as we all know, many organizations are starting to set, if they haven't already, their ESG targets. And procurement, as we are all very familiar with, are very well positioned to support their organizations to reach those ESG goals. But the question we often hear is, where do we start? So here is our simple 6-step approach. And in the very first circle, you see it's the first step is to translate organizational ESG goals into procurement strategy. To successfully do this, of course, you will need a level of visibility into your current performance. So for example, your emissions. And only then can you create an achievable plan. And we mentioned earlier that ESG is just beyond carbon emission reduction. So one of your plans and your actions might be to reduce scope 3 emissions, but it can also be improvement in your social metrics across your supply chain or increasing circularity. Then the second step is to adopt an ESG-enabled total value of ownership framework for strategic sourcing. So especially with ESG, it is now important to have that mindset shift to move just beyond cutting costs and securing supply. And with ESG, it's so important because the pressure for ESG is coming from your consumers, it's coming from your board, it's coming from the government. So there's a lot more value add in achieving your ESG goals than just cutting costs, which we think is also a byproduct of these activities. Then the third is to implement best-in-class ESG contractual clause. So this is challenging because, and we're talking here about building supplier trust. Often you'll see that your suppliers are at very different levels of maturity in the ESG journey. And when you have contractual clauses, it may be easier for some to meet and may be more difficult for the others to commit to. When we say, embed the ESG contractual clauses, it's really, we're also recognizing that you need to be flexible to work with your suppliers to see what level they're at and continuously monitoring them to bring that up to the level that you want them to be. But it'll take time. And so the fourth leads to that is to embed the ESG metrics, risk and opportunity into your SRM. So as mentioned earlier, every supplier is at a different journey, so you just need to continuously monitor it. And then you move into the stage where you want to embed your ESG goals, ESG KPIs into your operational process. So you become an ESG-driven organization. And then the last, but of course, this is not just limited to these 6 steps, is to secure continuous visibility of ESG metrics within your master data. So as you mature with your ESG process, also to start monitoring your suppliers, it's important to have that strong database so that you can move forward, you can continuously improve and achieve your ESG targets. So I'll pause here. Graham, I don't know if you have anything else to add on these 6 steps.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how they people in the audience where they feel they are on this journey. Perhaps we can go into that in a little bit later. I think the interesting thing is businesses, some businesses, and I think we see it on the a survey we did, a CPO survey we did with WBR Research, which is published this year. You can get it on our website. It seems to be a twin track where people are on the journey. About half the companies are on the process, seem to be ahead of the game, are comfortable that they've got the right process, people and technology, but another half feel left behind or are still starting out. So it seems to be wherever you are on the journey, it seems to be some companies are racing ahead, others are struggling to get going, and it'll be interesting to explore with you why.
Yeah, and this makes me half and half is not good, but ESG is, a growing area, and it actually makes me quite optimistic to see that a lot of companies have started their journey already. There's still a long way to go. We need to focus on the ones, who have not linked their organizational ESG goals to their own procurement goals, but also, have no visibility of where they are even at that process. With these two questions, I do want to focus a little bit on the one on the right. What's interesting to me was to see that there are already a lot of resources from these companies in people and in technology. However, you see less than half in processes and policies. And when we are speaking to people, what we realize is that you can have people, you can have technology, you can even have policies in place, but without that well-defined process, you really can't drive ESG in your organization. So having that process is really the backbone to making sure that ESG is being driven by procurement. Okay, perfect. And now we have this 2x2 kind of supplier tactics on decarbonization, and this is provided by the World Business Council and also PwC. And this one specifically is more focused on scope 3, but as many, or carbon emission reduction, but as many of the topics that we're talking about today can be expanded beyond just your environmental goals and also go into your social goals. So on the vertical axis here, we have a reward and penalty, and on the horizontal, we have non-financial and financial ways to motivate your suppliers to kind of jump on the bandwagon with your ESG journey. So on the top right, of course, it's reward progress, pay for performance, maybe you pay a premium for your product prices. But again, when you look at the TVO, it is a benefit for your organization to maybe pay a little bit more, but the other value that comes from your suppliers meeting your ESG goals or being ESG driven increases. The bottom right is probably one we want to stay away from, which is where you start to financially penalize. But that may be needed when you need to enforce performance in your supply base. And then on the left side is the non-financial. So on the top left, it's how you can build capabilities with your suppliers. And I think this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about every supplier will be different on the maturity scale. And this is also how you build the relationship, build trust with your suppliers by working together to build their capability. So rather than just, telling them to meet your ESG targets, work with them, train them, upskill them so that they're able to. And then the bottom left is leveraging procurement activities just to encourage your suppliers. So earlier, Graham talked about the Kraljic model here, and what we have here is a slight adaptation from Pagel. Hopefully I'm pronouncing his name correctly. So it's not too different, but this is more ESG focused. So on the vertical axis, it's a threat to the triple bottom line, and on the bottom horizontal axis is the risk and complexity. So strategic items and bottleneck items, not much change there. But the change here is splitting up your commodity into 3 areas. So one is strategic, transitional, and true commodity. So what we realize is even within your commodity products, there are some that will have a larger threat to your triple bottom line, and then some not low, but still medium threat. And then the way to approach them is also going to be very different. So Graham, you're an expert with 2x2s. This is not really a 2x2, but I don't know if you have any other comments in this section.
It's now a 3x2. It's the worst kind of diagram. But the point he observed in his research was that buyers were not behaving aligned to the Kraljic matrix, and he explored why. He looked at farmers that were getting invested in by food producers. I was just listening to Hotel Chocolat yesterday, who are paying a premium for their cocoa bean farmers and to ensure a living wage for them. So that would historically leverage categories were being treated like strategic categories, and Peggle observed this 10 years ago in a less well-known model. But we strongly advocate that this, as well as many other tools, should allow us to refresh our category strategy toolkits. Category strategies being vital to good procurement management, and there are many aspects of the historical category strategy toolkit that need refreshed. And we think this evolution of Kraljic reflects the new triple bottom line world we live in. So we would advocate, and if you've not seen this, we would encourage you to use it next time you're asking your team to consider category approach.
Great. And on to the next slide. Okay, perfect. So we come back to the 6-step model. We've talked a little bit about it. We've talked about the bottlenecks. And I think, as Graham mentioned earlier, we are interested to see where you are all at in this journey. So maybe I'll hand it over to Anna to start the poll.
Yeah, thank you. So now we're launching a second and final poll question. And again, we know it's not easy. We know it's not, a straight line, but for the sake of comparing amongst you who have tuned in, where do you see your company on the journey? Which step are you at? And Vaughn, would you agree then that it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on this, if we would rate it?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we missed the 6th one here, but I think if your organization is there, then that's great news. You're well ahead of the curve, I think.
Yeah, so the tool only allows for 5 answer options, and I could not really merge operational excellence with integrated in master data. So the 5 is obviously the most advanced in this. And then again, we know how it is. You can be less advanced in another area that really should, tip you off the curve. But is it translate organizational ESG goals into procurement strategy, adopt an ESG-enabled total value TVO framework for strategic sourcing, implement best practice, implement best-in-class ESG contract clauses, embed ESG metrics, risk and opportunity within supplier relationship management, build ESG into operational process excellence. So that TVO total value of ownership, where are you in your mind? No right or wrongs, just where would you position yourself to be on this scale? This was a tough one, so I'll give you a few more seconds to make a vote. And again, no right or wrong answers, just really interesting to compare amongst you who have tuned in today to take part of this very, very important session, covering what most companies feel are important, and yet we know many still struggle with actually getting that data insight and those processes going. So where do you see yourself? Now half of you have voted, so let's see if we can have a few more voting just to get a bit more feel. I know it can be difficult. So on the scale of 1 to 5 then, if you will, where would you rate yourself in your ESG journey? And obviously if it's non-relevant for you for whatever reason, it's hard to pick one. So I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Sharing the results. So 59% of you are on the sort of level 1, translating organizational ESG goals into procurement strategy. 18% are adopting an ESG-enabled total value of ownership framework for strategic sourcing. 6% of you have implemented best-in-class ESG contract clauses. 6% of you have embedded ESG metrics, risk and opportunity within supplier relationship management. And 12% of you have built ESG into operational process excellence. So possibly either of those 12 or slightly less have also could also tick the 6th box in. So Yvonne, what do you make of these results?
I think it's great to see that a lot of organizations are trying to make that link. It's not an easy activity because, what we're encouraging organizations to do is to use the resources out there to help you understand where your organization is today. So rather than, you need to collect data, but rather than going to your supply base, collecting the detailed, accurate data, leverage the resources available. There are a lot of estimates out there today to help you understand where your hotspots might be. So for example, with scope 3 emissions, where they are, and then prioritize your procurement strategy based on those categories of spend, those factors that are coming from the hotspots.
Thank you. So back to you.
So obviously at the end I'll maybe mention what GEP do, but we do help many companies, Fortune 500 companies, on the journey from 1 to 6 over time, particularly in the early stages when you're wrestling with your operating model. How could it actually work? What should we target in procurement? So we'd be delighted to talk to any of you in the early stages for sure, or at any stage. So let's just talk then a little bit about the next topics. I'm recognizing the time, of course, so we'll skate through this. But the other topic the 2 other topics of the day. So GEP conducted a survey with the Economist intelligence unit to look at the impact of the last few years and all the supply chain disruptions. And as you can see from this chart, there was a significant reputational, cost of working and cost of operations impact and cash flow impact, and many other negative effects of the pandemic. When we did the survey, that was obviously what was focused on, and now we have a war to deal with as well. So that was no surprise really, but the supply chain disruptions have cost businesses a lot of money, and the question then is, what have they been doing about it? So I offer you 3 emerging tactics. The first one is scenario testing. The World Economic Forum Risk Report highlights 5 key tips for dealing with this VUCA world, and their statement is: appreciate the vulnerabilities in your wider ecosystem, examine resilience to shortfalls, outages and delays of critical third-party assets and services, and the tolerances of those who depend on them. What that means, and if you were to go to the financial services sector, I was the director of procurement for an interim basis for a bank, and we spent a lot of time looking at business continuity plans and risk management due to the regulatory environment, but also the risk of things like cybersecurity and disruption as a result of IT outages. So learn lessons from that sector if you're not in that sector, in order to stress test and scenario play out war games with your key suppliers to see what would happen in the event of a high impact, low probability event, and are you prepared? Redundancy is the second tactic. Most of these you will be familiar with: increasing your buffer stocks, localizing your supply chain to optimize the networks, duplication, so buying from different sources or different things that achieve the same purpose. Just drawing out backup supply as a relatively unused tool, where it's not appropriate because of interdependency to multi-source. Some financial services institutions are now putting on retainer backup suppliers, so in the event that a critical vendor falls over, another one can step in, and that's not widely used, but it's an emerging growing one. The last one I would call it is insurance, revisiting your insurance levels to mitigate the cost of any losses from supply chain disruption. A third tactic that the survey, again with the Economist, showed, we asked which technologies are you investing in to build resilience in your supply network, and supply sensing is the answer. So that came most prominently. So building better communication platforms with your customers and suppliers so that you can flow information more quickly and more accurately, and avoid the bullwhip effect of misinterpretation. And but more data analytics came out as the top 2 to enhance real-time insights. We have a market intelligence service, and we're seeing a big uptake in interest for forecasting what might happen, understanding price indices, and so on. So that's hopefully 3 interesting tactics for you to think about in terms of building greater resilience into your supply chain. And in terms of risk management, which is obviously resilience is about how can you absorb, identify, absorb, and recover from an event. Risk management is about thinking about and spotting what could happen. And we're advocating 4 actions there. One is the digitization of risk management. A lot of, from supplier onboarding to financial checks to the ongoing management of issues, your enterprise risk frameworks. These are all things that typically sit in different places, and we're supporting a viewpoint that these things all need to come together now, so that your operational and extended enterprise risk can be managed more holistically. So we think that's a great way to get better visibility. Encouraging disclosure. One of the things that procurement's historically tough, demanding behaviors have driven is that suppliers are scared or won't disclose to you when things are going wrong. On-time delivery performance of suppliers is collapsing at the moment due to all of the macroeconomic issues. But suppliers aren't telling you, typically because it's too late. So we have the return of expediting to try and keep on top of these things. The expediting rule was a role I had in the 1990s. It was not been needed since then because on-time delivery performance was generally good. But in a world where the supplier is fearful they will lose business if they tell you that they have something bad in their supply chain, whether it's an ESG issue or a modern slavery issue or just simply a delivery issue, if they're fearful of disclosing that because they may lose business, then you've got to question, are you creating the right culture of trust and safety to allow people to share openly with you, which is surely a good thing. Proportionality on risk is another feature. Where in a world where the risk domains are proliferating, where I worked, we had identified 14 core business risk areas, and where you want to assess all of them, and increasingly to more depth, then you can end up with very large questionnaires going to potential suppliers, which is quite off-putting and slows down your business agility. So balancing individual risk expert opinion and asks to come up with a more proportional view on risk for any given supplier increases your agility. But we see there's a risk that you have to constantly manage to avoid being bloated in your asks of suppliers, because small businesses in particular, don't have the resource to respond to 350 questions. We're advocating question caps which can be applied in terms of number by using better governance internally. We're also advocating the greater use of industry utilities and industry standards, rather than asking your own bespoke question every time. Finally, a 4th tip is the one around onboarding and contract monitoring. We see frequently that the effort and due diligence given to manage risk before you award business is not consistently applied in the same way after business is awarded and in contract life. And sometimes there's an imbalance in consistency of practices pre and post contract award. And I think this would be we need to be more consistent as a profession to drive that. So that's some tips hopefully for you on risk and resilience building, depending on where you are on the journey. And we didn't ask a poll there, and I'm conscious of time. One last thing I just wanted to touch on then is just what can you do in this VUCA world to mitigate inflation? Part of it is about understanding your exposure. So understanding where you're exposed to currency and commodity inflation. And that's through market intelligence, that's through indices, that's through discussing with suppliers where are they exposed and where are their suppliers exposed. Looking at your own incentive model in a world where price savings are very difficult, where inflation is running at 5 to 10%, then you need to incentivize your procurement teams with a broader range of metrics that elevates cost avoidance, to be something of value. Historically, cost avoidance has been the poor cousin to direct price savings. Applying the wider levers, obvious, I'm sure to you, looking at inventory, looking at value engineering, re-engineering the products, to looking at the logistics costs, which are obviously increasing significantly. In the medium term, this notion of strengthening relationships, this is the trust building point, providing some financial support, trying to help the suppliers rather than hinder them, and looking for opportunities for win-win mutual profit gain rather than win-lose, which is often how relationships feel to the provider. And then obviously there's longer term approaches that take time, but embedding should cost modeling in your budgeting process to enable you to better predict and manage the risk within your business, and looking at restructuring your supply chain so that you're looking at alternative materials or near shoring. So I just wanted to touch on that very, very briefly, given the time. This last point, let's return to trust and finish off there. In Europe, there aren't many. Many of you will use Supplier 360 surveys to assess supplier sentiment, but there aren't many publicly available data sources at an industry level or at a global level around how do suppliers feel towards procurement. But in America, there is the Supplier Working Relations Index, and it's quite a good proxy, I feel, for how things are going. They look at the automotive industry and they look at the big auto suppliers. And as you can see here, there are winners like Toyota and Honda over the last 9 years, but there are losers as well. And net, there's not been an improvement over the last 9 years in working relationships and trust between suppliers and the major auto manufacturers. Why is trust building important, and what are the benefits of third-party trust? Well, one challenge procurement has is that it is resource constrained, and sometimes procurement is absent, therefore, from key strategic vendor management activities. It tends to, there are many instances where, having let the contract, procurement passes that over to the business who has their own vendor management function, or indeed just to the business, and procurement comes back in a few years and is not really close to strategic vendor management practices. In this world where we want to do more in ESG, more and get a better understanding of costs and help build resilience, we need to put more resources into strategic vendor management in order to increase our influence and build that long-lasting trust impact. Why does trust matter? It matters in terms of resource allocation. The idea of customer of choice, we've all heard it. It's a bit of a platitude now, a bit of a cliche, but it goes with it obviously in a world where a seller can choose where strategic or high quality resources are put, having strong relationships counts. In a world where you're trying to develop together products, having the access to the best investment from the supplier can give you a commercial advantage, and they can choose where to do that sometimes. And then from a competitiveness perspective, having awareness of a good relationship, the research shows delivers still better pricing compared to your peers. So 4 tips to build trust. Transparency. Now, it's information asymmetry. Information is power has been a saying that we use, and in fact, today information asymmetry is something we might want to think about whether we want to share more. Perhaps you want to share your category strategies more openly, not just keep them as internal documents. Perhaps you want to be clearer about your goals or ambitions with the suppliers. And the more you communicate, the more trust is built. And the more you're willing to share, the more trust is built. So that would be one thing to think about. Empathy. I mentioned this safe environment for sharing bad news, so it's not a threatening place to be a supplier in your business. The other point is demanding. That came at the start. Procurement's known for making impossible asks. Often that's celebrated, but perhaps now is the time for reasonable asks that can be achieved so that suppliers do not feel as if their backs are against the wall. Consistency, obviously delivering on your side of any contractual obligations. Perhaps I've put the last one as best friend. Perhaps you can learn from the sales profession. They are doing account planning. They're looking at your business organization and building stakeholder maps and working out where influence is and where power is within your organization. Perhaps you, for your strategic vendors, need to have the same organizational map and work out how are you going to get in touch with the CEO, how are you going to build relationships with the key strategic board members of your supplier organizations, and how you're going to strengthen those over time. The last point is about avoiding games. The problem the profession has is that we've overinvested for 40 years in negotiation. We see ourselves as master game players in the game theory world, but sellers see through that. They see procurement as a function that plays games, and that reduces trust levels. Research shows that sellers are happier with a win-win scenario, whereas buyers will typically go for a win-lose if they can. And I wonder if that game playing aspect in this time needs to be readdressed to build more trust. So that's some thoughts for you on and I hope you found the whistle-stop tour through trust, ESG resilience, and ESG useful. Just briefly, who are GP? We are 5,000 people who specialize in procurement and supply chain. It's all we do. We're all over the world, including Scandinavia. And we've been going for 20 years. We put together a mix of services, technology, and intelligence to create unique solutions to solve your procurement problems, to increase your procurement impact and drive procurement efficiencies. And I just thought it might be interesting to show you an offering we've put together, for example, to help support the Ukraine-Russia conflict that uses a mix of market intelligence to help you assess the situation and impact it would have on you, brings in our supply chain experts to look at how you might re-engineer your supply base to de-risk it, and then brings in our procurement teams to look at sources of supply and helps you with both short-term tactical work as well as long-term, medium-term support to re-engineer things to strengthen the resilience of what you do. So that's GP. That's a little overview. We do a whole lot of things for a lot of companies, but that's just one example. If you're needing anything in procurement supply chain, please get in touch.
Yes, thank you so much. And obviously, we will also share the recording and slides. And our time is up. Those of you who have to leave, no worries, do that. We'll continue a few more minutes because I do think we have some pressing questions to discuss and look into. And I just want to circle back. First of all, thank you, Yvonne, and thank you, Graham, for an excellent presentation. Obviously, we chewed on a lot here, but I think you did a great job really putting some concrete aspects into what each and every company are really struggling with. A comment on the ESG journey. We find ourselves at level 1, and ongoing with level 6, while in some areas being at level 4. It seems we are a bit all over the place and not doing this in a structured journey process approach. And maybe that's also why it was a bit hard for companies to just choose like expected. That's how it often is, right? Yvonne, from your experience, what do you think of this?
Yeah, so I think what I've seen from ESG is that a lot of the strategies or the targets are set without really understanding where your organization is performing, which is why we found step 1 so critical. And what I mentioned earlier is step 6 is, having that master data, but also we also see that some companies, that's a bottleneck for them because they try so hard to get the perfect data specific to their organizations that they spend a lot of resources in that area. But in the world we live in today, ESG is such a hot topic that you just need to start taking action. So that's why we mentioned earlier, don't focus too much on getting the perfect data. Leverage the resources that are available today to help you get that estimate. And then eventually you just move on to the other steps. I think there are some steps there that can happen in parallel. So you might identify a category that's already a hotspot and move forward with that strategy where you're still trying to figure out the rest of it. So I think there's no, there's no one way. It will be a little bit. You will see that you will progress in different paces or in parallel.
Yeah. And another one, and feel free to those of you who are staying put, feel free to send in questions should you want to. We'll continue a few more minutes. How to ensure a backup supplier actually have available capacity in case we call on them in a situation of disruption with our current supplier. And I mean, we had conversations just a couple of weeks back where it was evident that suppliers today may not even give a quote lasting longer than a day, possibly not longer than a week. So, I mean, and at the same time, you need to do all the due diligence and you have to, follow the processes and everything. I mean, how do you even manage that? Do you have any experiences, and what have you heard, Graham?
So from a backup supply perspective, it's about having capability ready, and price may be negotiated on point, potentially depending on the volatility, but it's having that capability on standby. And I think procurement's very focused on the commercial price point, and therefore that focus probably needs to be reduced. If you're trying to reduce, the priority is not price, the priority is having a resilient supply chain. And you're absolutely right. There may be an urgent negotiation needed, but if you set up the contractual mechanisms to allow for indexation on the key volatile commodities, then the contractual agreement should withstand inflationary pressures if you've built that in up front, or there might be a negotiation. But the key point is you've built in that backup capacity to secure your business.
Yeah,
you only do this very strategic. Strategic.
Yeah, and perfect. I guess also in that lies the people aspect that you both were circling back to, where, how much do you dare to say is going on because of what impact that may have on, whatever you're tasked to do within an organization as a buyer or supplier. So I think that is, and we are far, far away from computers doing all of this for us, right? I mean, that's not happening anytime soon. So I think the people aspect is really, really interesting. And I think circling back to scope 3 then, Von, what would you say are the bottlenecks for when it comes to starting that journey with the suppliers and the role that procurement should have in it?
Yeah, so I think especially with scope 3, procurement should be in the driver's seat because, as I mentioned, in the very beginning, that's where they're positioned. And in some areas, they might facilitate the conversation. In some areas, they might lead the conversation. One bottleneck, I've mentioned data a lot, data visibility a lot, so I won't dive any deeper on that. But I think it's also getting your senior leadership sponsor to make sure that you can prioritize scope 3 reduction, because ESG, whether it's scope 3 or any other area, it's not one of those procurement activities where you see the short-term benefits. You don't see the benefits immediately. It might not be as tangible as in other areas. It is a longer-term activity, and I think you need to get that sponsorship to invest the right resources to achieve those targets, because it will go many years to actually ultimately achieve it, but it's what's needed.
And I think
I would add.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I would add, Anna. One of the challenges I would add is that it's trust. Procurement's not trusted internally either. So, despite the fact procurement is really well positioned to lead on scope 3, often the business doesn't want you anywhere near your strategic vendor relationships because they see you as the guy who's going to cut costs, not add value. And so there's a trust building piece internally as well.
Yeah, and I think all of this also circle back to what are the people working within procurement now and ahead. And I think the tasks put on procurement today and on, considering risk and resilience, and considering the amount of spend actually happening in businesses in relation to turnover, and it's daunting. So it is an interesting side conversation what category managers need to take on their plate, and how they need to be able to, like you said as well, Graham, incorporate different aspects into their ways of working that may not have been before. And also, of course, looking ahead to try and figure out where do we take the next step, and obviously being that trust creating individual. So I think that is, and that's also to me quite concrete. I mean, that's possible to evaluate within an organization where you're at trust-wise, and how you work with your supply base, and where the different the different steps are within the organization to be able to create that thought of ESG strategy and so on. Any final words, Von, that we should leave our audience with, those who listen now or those who will listen to the recording?
I think, especially with ESG, a topic that I'm very passionate about, it's, I think we just need to start acting. We need to get the sponsorship to start acting, to be able to drive it in our organizations. We can't wait for the perfect data. We can't wait for the perfect policies to come out. It's just something that needs to get started.
And what should they do then? Number one, today, when they leave this session.
Well, I think it's just to understand what your organization, what the first step was, understand what your organizational targets and priorities are, and then understand within your organization, procurement organization, how can you help your wider enterprise achieve those targets.
Yeah, and finding out from top management how much may it cost. What are the mandates? How disruptive can we be to make this happen? I think all of that is for sure a part of making those actions come to life. Graham, what are your final words for us?
In an uncertain time, procurement's long-held tool bag needs a refresh. The wider remit that we now have means that we can't keep putting more and more on the resources, limited resources we have. So operating models need reviewed. Maybe companies like GP can help with that, and also take off some of the low value added activities to be managed. And the other part is, of course, we would argue the whole process framework and strategic frameworks need a refresh. So have a think about how you can transform to do more with less.
Yeah, that would probably be a great dream. A big dream for many, do more with less, because that's, like you said, it's often the situation for procurement. And with that, thank you for those of you who stayed tuned, even though we broke the time limit. Thank you so much, Von. Thank you, Graham. Thank you, GEP, for enabling EBG Network to do this session. I think we had some great insights, and we'll send you the slides and recording. And Graham and Von, I'm sure you're open for further discussions.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So with that said, I do hope to see you in real life sometime shortly. Thank you from EBG, thank you GP, thank you Graham, and thank you Von, and thank you for those of you who have listened. Bye.
Thanks, Anna.